Okay, we're back to our Tuesday agenda, and next is a presentation on the airport design guidelines. We have staff here with Jim Elwood, and we also have some members from your design committee. I'm sure you'll go around and introduce them to us.
Thank you, Chair. Jim Elwood, I'm the airport director. Thank you all for being here and taking some time. Today is the kickoff meeting of our design guidelines for the airport, which we just see as a continuation of ongoing work that we've had at the airport to make sure that it fits into the community, keeps the community involvement alive, and takes it to the next step. You may recall that in the airport master plan, which was adopted in December, one of the recommendations that came from that was to pursue these design guidelines along with a surface transportation study. So that's really what we're here to talk about. A while back, the Board of County Commissioners put together a task force committee. I'll ask them to introduce themselves here in just a moment, along with just a moment of 2 sentences or so about what brought them here, who they represent. First, I also want to introduce our team. The consulting group that's been put together is a really strong one, I believe. Immediately to my left is Tim Malloy at TG Malloy. And Tim has extensive planning history in our valley and quite active in several projects at the airport in the past. J.D. Ingram is a principal at J Aviation, who's our design engineer, our engineer of record for the airport, and they do infrastructure design, those kind of things predominantly for us. I'd also like to introduce Bob Felsberg. Bob's with, of course, Felsberg, Holt, and Ulovic. He'll be involved heavily in the transportation study component. One key point as we go through some background information today, and we're going to show you a lot of information that relates to other projects that have been underway and some other things that we need to consider as we move forward. So for some of you might have seen this in the past, some of you it might be fresh. We would like to kind of stop and take questions or just clarifying questions if we could, because of timeline, kind of between the steps. So after Tim Malloy finishes his first round, and then when JD finishes his, then of course at the end. So we do want to get you out of here on time. One really important thing, and I've heard this in the community, so I want to make sure we're clear. We're not trying to design a new structure at the airport. This is another piece of the puzzle that helps us form what we want to see the airport become in the future. But it's not a design of the terminal building. It's not a design of any other facilities that might be built. However, these items, whatever this document creates, which we expect it to be a very substantial, meaty document, is to go into further design should and when it takes place. So that's kind of my opening remarks. With that, I'd like to turn it over and have that introduction, self-introduction, done by the committee. And if I might ask Fred Mosier to start.
I'm Fred Mosier, a longtime resident of Pitkin County. I'm with Atlantic Aviation and have been at the airport for over 20 years.
I'm Jackie Francis, and I'm one of the closest neighbors to the airport at the North 40. And I've been on these airport committees since the inception, so I have a lot of the history. So I've stayed on as the North 40 sort of representative for all the airport things.
David Corbin, Vice President of Planning and Development for Aspen Skiing Company. At this point in my life, I'm a little chagrined to say I probably had more than 25 years of experience in development in the Mountain West and resort towns, and then thusly been involved in design guidelines and complying with design guidelines, applying for permissions and approvals under guidelines, and instructing my own design professionals what direction I wanted the design to go. So I've had quite a bit of experience in it. Likewise participated in the Master Plans Community Advisory Committee. So I've been on this process as well with kind of airport planning to date in the past 2 or 3 years.
And just in time.
Hi. What do I say?
I'm Leslie Lamont.
Okay. Hi, I'm
Leslie Lamont. I'm a former county and city employee.
Hi, I'm Rachel Richards, Pitkin County Commissioner.
My name is John Columbus from Columbus Architects, and my office is in the ABC, and I also live in the North 40.
Rob Ittner, Pitkin County Commissioner.
George Newman, Pitkin County Commissioner.
I'm Mike Gowsley, Pitkin County Commissioner.
And Steve Child, Pitkin County Commissioner.
My name is Dorothy Fromer. I'm the Director of Guest Services for the Aspen Chamber. Part of my responsibility is managing the information desk, guest services desk at the airport.
I'm Jeff Newsom. I live in West Buttermilk and
Airplane note.
and I guess I used to be a developer, and I don't know why I'm here, but I'm here.
You participated in the last two master plans, right, Jim?
You know, I want to make sure that, at least for myself, that I've been on numerous committees that boards have appointed, have been on boards and so forth, that we're just not here to make it look good for the public, and then the board who appointed us, obviously you guys, do whatever they feel like doing anyway, which is what's happened in the past on other committees that I've been on and other boards that I've been on. And that we do a lot of work, and we do a report this thick, and they stick it in their drawer and say thank you very much. And you know, I don't want to play that game.
Very good.
Rob Snyder, I worked with John McBride. I was also on the master plan committee, and I had the dubious distinction of being made to read the whole master plan by John. I don't know if it was punishment or what, but I had to read it cover to cover.
John Kruger, Director of Transportation for the City of Aspen. I've been on the master plan process on the airport before. And in a former life, I was a station manager, director of stations for Rocky Mountain Airways, Continental Express, Continental, so back in the day.
Fantastic, thank you all. And there's, John, there's a seat, Jeff, there's a seat for you. While they take their positions, I think it's important to know we have a very diverse group, and that's really the intent of this, is to make sure the community input process is got some technical folks, some neighborhood folks, pretty broad spectrum. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Malloy.
Thank you and good afternoon. And I want to express a particular thank you for the task force members who are volunteering to help us with this document, with these two projects. I think we're going to try and make this as interesting and compelling and efficient and concise a process as we can for you. We expect you to be vigorous in your review of the material that we give you, but we're going to try and be, as much as we can, a resource to make slogging through some of the documents that we're going to have to discuss in the context of this process as easy as possible. So we want to be a resource for you. As you see on the third bullet point on this slide that's on the screen, it says project components, and there are two of them. There is a design guidelines document. We've talked a lot about what this, or we talked for a minute, Jim introduced about what this project is not. And I want to just take a minute here before we proceed to talk about what it is. So there's two parts to it. One is the design guidelines. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the other is the surface transportation best practices study. That's a long name, and essentially what it means is that we want to look at the examples set at other comparable airports around the country in terms of how they deliver people to and from their airport facility, and try and select from those airports the best ideas that might work here in Aspen. So that is the sort of fundamental idea of that project. Our presentation is we're going to try and keep this to about 35 minutes. We're hoping to leave you with 45 minutes to an hour to give us feedback on a few items that we have identified that we want to get feedback on today. And those three items are, we want to chat with you and get your input about and use your knowledge to seek out some ideas about comparable airports that we can study for purposes of the Surface Transportation Best Practices Study. We also have two slides in the presentation that you're going to see, one on core values and one on issue areas. And the core values are essentially going to be the sort of overarching thoughts that we're going to have in our minds when we work with you and on the background work for this project. that are sort of the driving ideas that we're going to keep in our minds. And the issue areas are essentially those key components that we're going to be including and working on in the design guidelines document itself. What areas are we actually going to be focusing on when we create design guidelines? So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about what the project is. The purpose of the design guidelines is to develop a set of guidelines that ensure that future development or redevelopment at the airport is consistent with community values. We're going to be looking at architectural guidelines, environmental sensitivity, neighborhood compatibility, sustainability, the kinds of things that we all find important and value in the airport. And I'm actually just going to pause here for a second. Rob, could I ask you to just shift a little bit to the right? So
I could slide over here, so.
Oh, we didn't get the photo in our packet, so we should be watching this?
It's even better. The Transportation Best Practices Study is, as I mentioned a little bit ago, it's intended to look at airports across the country and define what they do well in terms of delivering passengers to and from the airport. Our main goal here is to try and diminish reliance on private automobiles, rental vehicles, etc. The recommendation for this aspect of the study came out of the Planning Commission during the 2012 Airport Master Plan Review, wherein they had requested that we please try and help to lower the impacts of the airport on the surrounding neighborhoods and on the highway. And we came to the agreement that this would be the best approach, to bring forward some tangible and real recommendations in terms of how we might be able to do that. So the process that we've set up includes three types of input from the community. One is the task force, and we have 6 meetings of the task force, and the first of those meetings is the one that we are attending today. Meeting number 5 is going to be one where we're going to be talking about the recommendations that's going to come out of the best practices study. But those meetings are going to be attended, only 2 of those meetings are going to be attended by the board and the task force members as we are today. This meeting and meeting number 5. The rest will be just with the task force, and we'll be getting our primary input from you. We're also going to be doing a couple of focus group sessions. And we're going to be doing an open house toward the end of the process, and before we go into the last component of the process, which is going to be a formal adoption by the Board of County Commissioners of the design guidelines document itself, and if appropriate, the recommendations of the Surface Transportation Best Practices Study. Public outreach, I mentioned the task force representation. They introduced themselves this morning. In terms of the focus groups, we're going to be working with tenants, users, neighbors, staff at the airport who use the airport, who are extremely familiar with the airport, who know how the sort of little corners and areas and aspects of it that work and don't work, in order to sort of draw out ideas about how to create design guidelines that will ensure that it performs better in the future. As I said, we're also going to be doing a community open house toward the end of the process, and we are going to have all of the documentation that we create as a result of the process, including some of the background resource documents, which we'll be discussing today, posted on the AspenAirportPlanning.com website. In fact, all the documents that we're going to be going through here today that are later on in the presentation are already posted there. And so that'll be a resource for you to look at these documents if you feel the need to do so. We will also be a resource to you in terms of myself as a planner in the Valley who's worked on a number of these related documents, and J.D. Ingram and J'Aviation with respect to FAA standards, and Bob on transportation planning related issues. So, the design guidelines themselves are going to have a variety of audiences. They're going to be applied to all construction at the airport. So there are going to be site design oriented standards, there are going to be architectural oriented standards, there are even going to be some operational oriented standards which will be primarily for the use of the airport staff. But it's going to be reviewed by developers, by staff, by people who are interested in doing development at the airport, people who operate currently at the airport. So we're going to try and make this document broadly understandable, readable, and to communicate to a broad audience. The Transportation Best Practices Study is going to be a little bit different in as much as those recommendations are going to go to the task force and to the Board of County Commissioners directly, and there'll be a decision at the end of that study as to whether or not some or all of the set of recommendations that are contained in that document might be brought forward in some way, implemented on. The study process is going to be to establish a framework by reviewing past studies, other literature, et cetera, select a peer set of airports, comparable airports that we're going to actually do a survey of and find out how they operate and what they find works and doesn't work, and then a reporting out stage to bring forward the potential strategies that we think are going to be helpful, with the main focus being encouraging alternate use or use of alternate transportation modes. So core values, we're going to come back to this at the end, but these are statements that came out of the 2012 Airport Master Plan process in a variety of forums. They came from the charrettes, and they came from the task force members, and they came from the board members in some cases. And we've selected these because they are particularly applicable to what we're going to be working on, which is standards to help guide and define how development at the airport gets done. Not exactly where it gets done, because a lot of that was discussed during the master plan process, but how it gets done aesthetically, how we minimize visual impact, how we handle traffic, how we make it a pleasing experience for pedestrians, etc. So we're going to want to come back and talk to these at the end. Now, for the next handful of slides, I'm going to be reviewing a handful of resource documents, which are some of them very lengthy, some of them very technical oriented. Don't worry about having to read all this. We're going to try and be as much of a resource as we can for you, particularly the task force members. There's a lot of technical information, especially on the FAA standard side, which JD will address. And today we're going to focus on giving you a snapshot of what we believe are important, the important recommendations, statements, policies, et cetera, in these documents as relates to what we're going to be doing, which is developing the design guidelines and looking at this transportation studies. So first, for example, we have the 2012 Airport Master Plan, which was adopted in December of last year. And it identifies, the likely set of improvements which are going to be coming forward over the next 20 years. This document was done as a 20-year horizon. And there are essentially three major areas of improvements that came out of the Airport Master Plan. The first is the rearrangement of the east side of the airport in order to make the facilities more operationally efficient, create more room for GA aircraft parking, and consolidate automobile parking. The second is a potential, leaving room for a potential second FBO on the west side and an associated west side taxiway to serve that west side facility. And the third is redevelopment of the passenger terminal, the components of which are listed under item 3, replacement of the actual terminal building, parking, passenger loading gates, emphasis on transit connection, which we talked about a lot during the charrettes. So these are the kind of setting the stage of what the design guidelines are going to be applying to. And here, this is quite difficult to see. This is essentially the recommended improvement plan from the master plan. And the three areas of which I spoke, and I'll try not to singe Rob's hair as I point here. The three areas of which I spoke, this is the terminal area and the associated improvements, roadway, parking, ramp area, car wash facilities, et cetera. And then this is the sort of area which is the east side reorganization. And then the third is the west side second FBO facility and the associated taxiway. I also want to point out that throughout all of the planning efforts at the airport, we have continued to preserve the transit corridor that shows up in the entrance to Aspen Record of Decision along the airport side of the highway for some future potential transit technology, as yet to be determined. Another document that has been important for the airport is the Airport Landscape Master Plan, which was adopted in 2010, and it has both sort of some broad general recommendations as well as focusing in on a few key areas for some more detailed recommendations relative to pedestrian areas, seating areas, and so on and so forth. But it essentially divides the airport into a number of zones that reflect sort of the existing ecosystems out there, and strengthening and improving those with future plantings, et cetera. Also adopted as part of the master plan, the airport master plan, is a set of design intent specifications for signs. This document includes an inventory of the existing signs and recommendations regarding how signs at the airport should be replaced, improved, including sort of some general thoughts about where new signage is needed or where existing signs need to be improved, as well as, and again, without trying to singe Rob, some really detailed drawings showing the design for signs, the construction details, installation, et cetera, et cetera. I will tell you that much of this work has been done, and one of the things that we can talk about during the design guidelines is whether or not this palette of sign materials, colors, et cetera, is still something that we want to maintain going forward. Then there's a 2012 Aspen Airport Community Plan update, which is a very broad, aspirational document that includes a number of key policy statements relative to the airport, which you see in items 1 through 6 at the bottom of this slide. One of the more important recommendations of that plan was the recommendation to create the West of Maroon Creek Plan, which has been going on for about the last year and a half, and as I understand it, is going to be done and ready for adoption December? October? October. And the airport has participated with the Planning Commission and the Community Development Department on that, and we can help you understand the contents of that document, which some of the major recommendations are shown on this slide. It's a little bit different document than the ACP. It's a more comprehensive land use plan. It's going to have an actual future land use map. It is probably the document that's going to be most important when any project that's going to be developed at the airport comes forward for actual construction. One of the last sort of reviews is called a location and extent review, and this document will be very important in the context of reviewing location and extent. And the plan does include a set of scenic guidelines which address in a fair amount of detail landscaping, lighting, signage, and so forth. And so these are guidelines that we're going to want to understand and make sure that we don't run contrary to, and try and maintain the spirit of those when we do the guidelines for the airport. The Highway Access Control Plan, this was a plan that was approved last year as well, and its primary import really was to sort of set the locations for access for the airport when we were looking at the airport master plan update and specifically how to redesign the terminal area. And it recommends that we maintain this current fully controlled access at Baltic Avenue, and that there be a future fully controlled access at this location, which is directly across from the ProBuild site, just up valley of the Baltic Avenue, and that this access, which is across from Service Center Road and provides access to the Atlantic Aviation Terminal area and parking, be continued to provide access as well. The airport has recently completed an airport wildlife hazard management plan, and the purpose of this document, fundamentally speaking, is to ensure that the airport is a safe place for operating aircraft, and we have had a number of bird strikes and such over time, and over the last decade or so the FAA has increased its emphasis on managing wildlife for the benefit and the safety of operating aircraft. There are a number of important recommendations that we've selected for you to consider during the design guidelines process, and one of them is this recommendation number 3 that talks about modifying the landscape master plan because it includes some recommendations that involve landscape materials that might be considered bird attractants or wildlife attractants. So these are the kind of things that we'll be looking at in the design guidelines to make sure that where modifications need to be done, they can be done. So I'm going to turn it over momentarily to J.D. Ingram to talk about FAA standards. Then I've got a couple slides at the end that I'll talk to, and then we'll commence discussion.
If we could just pause and make sure if there's any clarifying questions that you'd like to cover in Tim's portion, we should do that. Otherwise, we're ready to jump ahead.
Everybody okay? All right, great. Thank you, Tim.
Great. Well, I'm going to shift and talk about the exciting world of federal regulations. Who doesn't love to talk about the federal regulations?
Don't turn the lights down.
I'm going to make this as painless as possible and go through it as quickly as possible. The intent of this is just to provide the framework to let everybody know that there are, when you work on airports, they're very active, they're very complex, and they're federally regulated. So what we want to do as a task force and a committee is understand what those regulations are and then work within them. And we were talking about this morning. The purpose of the slides that I'm going to go through, that's going to be the measuring stick. So when the design guidelines come out, we're going to use the work products and measure them up to make sure they're compatible with federal regulations. And my role working with Tim and our role is to make sure that you have all the support that you need as you go through this so that we are operating everything in the sandbox the way we need to play. So. A couple of the biggest areas that the federal government regulates on airports is safety. Where buildings are located, runways, taxiways, all have safety areas related to them, object-free zones. You just can't haphazardly put anything on an airport that you want to. There's so much regulation that mandates what can be put where. The master plan process that you went through actually worked through a lot of your facility locations. So a lot of this work, the pre-planning work, has been done. When we shift away from runways and taxiways, the next closest thing to the center line of the airport is typically the apron areas. And Commissioner Ittner and I were talking about this before the meeting today. Is one of the things that is really important at this particular airport in your backyard is the slope of the ground. The airport has a 2% slope tied to it. So as you start to create apron environments, ramps where aircraft park, those have to be flat areas. And actually 2% may feel flat, but when you're fueling aircraft and taxiing aircraft, it needs to be 1%. So there's some challenges there that have been evaluated in the master plan and the terminal area plan. But aprons are very important. Control towers, having line of sight to aircraft on any of the movement areas like runways and taxiways, being able to see those airplanes is important. So we can't have structures blocking them. Going in a little bit deeper as we get closer to the terminal, airport terminal facilities, the FAA has guidelines of how to do that stuff. And as Jim stated, this task force and this study is not about designing facilities. But I will touch on the things that the FAA looks at when they do design facilities. Forecasting, peak demands. And part of the conversation was the use of the airport in peak season drives the sizing and the capacity. All that will be evaluated in the design phase if and when that goes forward, but that's not part of the design guidelines. They go on and look at functional relationships of terminals, where the major components are, gates, taxi positions, that type of stuff. As you go deeper into the terminal building, you have TSA requirements, and I have a slide on that. And then I would say ancillary facilities, parking, circulation, roadway. Some of the things that you are going to be considering is the airport is the front door to the community for those traveling by air. And it's an important statement. And I think this committee is going to get to put their fingerprints all over what that experience is going to feel like and be. Part 77 is a federal regulation that deals with safety, and everything that the FAA deals with is safe and efficient air travel, and that's also part of the core values of this community. Part 77 is like a bubble that protects the airport for airspace. So it evaluates all the approach surfaces, so that buildings don't penetrate, terrain doesn't penetrate, that type of stuff. And lastly is TSA. TSA has their own guidelines and recommendations for airport security and how airports are planned and designed, and we will be supporting you on any interface that this group has with TSA regulations.
Okay, so the next few slides are just to talk briefly about the aspects of the Pitkin County Code. There are two titles in particular that are applicable to the work that we'll be doing. The first one is called Title 10, and that is essentially the standards and guidelines in the code that govern the airport. And it is divided into two major sections. One is general and the other one is minimum standards. In the general section, you see on this slide the kinds of things that are addressed in that part of the code. Safety, sanitation, hours of operation, noise, fueling, et cetera, et cetera. And these are sort of the fundamental guidelines to make sure that the airport operates efficiently, safely, serves the public as it is intended to do. The second section called Division 2 is standards that relate to how commercial aeronautic activities occur at the airport. And it's really intended to create an even playing field for those aeronautical services that an airport provides to its community. It's different for every community in terms of what kinds of things are provided or what kind of things the community residents seek out. But for example, these are common uses are air taxi, training, aircraft rental, fuel sales, and some of the information in this section is general and operational in nature, and others of it is very specific, like for fuel farms specifying a minimum tank size for fuel storage. So these are going to be things that we're also going to want to understand at least to some level, so that we make sure that if there is an area that we cross into that's governed by this section of the code, that we'll be aware of that. The last one is Title 11, which is the county's building and construction code, and obviously this applies to all the construction development of all structures at the in the county as well as at the airport. Its fundamental purpose is to ensure safety, that buildings are designed in accordance with building codes. The Pitkin County Building Code happens to be based on the International Building Code of 2009. One aspect of the building code, which I think is going to be perhaps significant for this project, is going to be the International Energy Conservation Code, and as much as there's a potential for the terminal area building to include photovoltaic systems, et cetera. So that's going to be something we'll want to understand. To some extent, we're going to be looking to the architects on the committee who have a deep understanding of how this code works and for interpretations and so on and so forth. But suffice it to say that this is the last step before a building gets built, and we're going to want to make sure that anything that we put in the standards doesn't run contrary to that code. So lastly, we have a list of issue areas, which we have begun. These are not necessarily comprehensive, but it was a good beginning point for us to start talking about what do we want to address with the standards document. So you look at quality of experience and you see aesthetics and convenience, pedestrian accessibility, taking advantage of views from facilities, in particular the terminal building at the airport, making sure that the facilities at the airport aren't visually imposing on the adjacent roads. One of the things that we heard most commonly during the master plan project was that if we're going to do a new terminal building at the airport, that we should try and make it not too unlike the building that's there, that it sort of lays down into the landscape. It is not in sort of an omnipresent building that looms over the highway that's a huge architectural statement. And so this is going to provide us sort of the background for considering what elements, characteristics, factors are we going to look at during the process of developing the design guidelines. So I wouldn't mind if everyone would sort of look at the items on this list, and here I'd like to pause and give us an opportunity to discuss these issue areas and hear your thoughts about whether or not this list seems appropriate, comprehensive, if there's something missing. And then I'd also like to, after we've done that, to pop back to the core values, look at that slide for a moment, and then at the end chat about your thoughts about comparable airports for purposes of looking at those surveys of comparable airports for the surface transportation portion of the study.
All right, thanks, Tim. So anything that we see that is missing that we'd like to add or consider, Michael?
Well, I think initially, Jeff mentioned it, how do we guarantee that this is a document that doesn't waste the committee's time and that is an enduring document that takes their recommendations forward and that we use over time? And that was a challenge. How do we do that?
Well, there are a couple ways. One of them was discussed in our proposal, where when we talk about how this document is implemented, and one of those thoughts was that a committee would be set up at the airport that would consist of perhaps a participant from airport administration, a participant from tenants, perhaps a volunteer from the community, an architect or planner, and that they would be responsible for doing essentially what you could almost call like a homeowners association design review process for projects that come in that are going to be constructed at the airport. So that document would be the fundamental core tool that they would use in a design review process. We also talked about the fact that this whenever the airport does improvements at the facility, we're required to go through a location and expense review. That process is typically fairly far along. It's at least through conceptual design, and that anyone who was doing work on behalf of the airport designing a facility would use this document as part of their conceptual design process, so that by the time we got to a location and expense review, it would have incorporated the recommendations of this document.
So what you're saying is that it is going to be placed on a shelf. There will be an active lifetime document that will guide us from.
That's correct. It's actually going to have an implementation chapter that's going to talk about some of these things and changes to it and how it grows and is used.
Yeah. The other thing that I really couldn't find here was although it's implied, is user experience, is traveler experience, and some value applied to that. These are essentially local concerns, the massing, the aesthetics, but what's it going to be like for a disembarking passenger?
Right.
I don't think that's high enough in this order here.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback off of that. I know we talked about this during the master plan process, but in terms of looking at transportation options, I think some of that would go to Michael's concerns.
Yeah, because I mean, you could have alternate transportation methods that nobody's going to use. I mean, or that are just not convenient for the user. So it seems to me you have to analyze those from the user's point of view.
Right.
Is it going to be used?
Rob?
In looking at the core values and the issue areas, it seems to me like there's a big gap, which is supporting the prosperous economy of our community.
Okay.
I mean, we touch on the experience, we touch on all these different things, but let's face it, the airport is our biggest economy driver here. And I think in everything that we do throughout the design process, we have to talk about how this is going to support our prosperous economy. And with balance of the other things that have been mentioned. But I'm really almost in shock that that's not in here at all.
I gotta say something right now, because you guys have all three said stuff that really is kind of against how I feel, being a neighbor right there. And, this is a busy airport from our perspective, and it has got a lot going on, and I just wanna keep it high on the list, that the people that live there are extremely important in this process, because we actually live there, we're not passing through, we're not driving by, we actually live there. So, I just want to make sure that stays high on the list.
And I think bouncing back on Rob, I think he did talk about a balance, you know,
Yeah,
understanding
balancing
it,
those things.
understanding it is an economic driver for the community, but there has to be a balance in there. I think that's what Rob was getting
My
at.
employees that work here that need passengers coming in for their jobs.
Well,
Everybody's connected to somebody in the economy
They're
working
busy.
here.
I'm actually going to go back to the core values because these are really good points, and I want to make sure that we all have that up on the screen to inform this discussion. So I think if you look at the first 2 points, maintain a safe and efficient airport, retain environmental sensitivity, noise, air quality, that gets to, you know, the airport's key responsibility, but I think the one about the economy is something that's not well stated here, so.
Other thoughts, Rachel?
Yeah, I could see emphasizing within the core values, just the term, you know, minimizing impact on neighborhoods. I mean, maybe that's under environmental sensitivity, where we're already talking about noise, air quality, transit, things like that. But I do agree that should be kept in the forefront. I also agree with Rob as, you know, putting up there one of the purposes of the airport. So I guess I'm back on issue areas where you started. But, and this tags off of some of the comments that Michael made, as he used the term passenger experience. I've used this term before, but I think we need to think as the group about what type of amenities we would like to see within the airport for that passenger experience,
Right.
so that when it goes to design, there is space for them, and we're not just saying, oh, well, this kind of kiosk could fit over there in that corner, or this could go over here. You know, whatever those amenities are that we would like to provide, we should be talking about those early on so they can be designed in. And the second thing is, I just had picked up on in one of the standards and screening documents you'll be using, was minimum ADA requirements. And I would like to think about, you know, what are, I don't know if it's maximum ADA requirements, but what are, you know, more than minimal. Because we have an aging population as a country, and the more I travel, I certainly see more and more injured veterans traveling. And I want to make sure that we're thinking very fully, and someone come back and say, wow, that was the easiest airport we've ever traveled in with Grandma, or that was the easiest airport to get in and out of with those sort of things. So let's go for more than that. I also kind of wonder if under the issues areas, and I know there's the transportation task force over here and this group here, but to make sure they're fully integrated as we get to the end of this. So under issue areas, I would certainly see transportation connection, circulation being an issue area, so that they really work together well.
Other thoughts or comments? It could be from the committee as well. Yeah.
How much, in terms of coming up with a series of design guidelines, how much are we going to know as a committee, or how much will be informed by a program that's already defined? I mean, it occurred to me, listening to Rachel's comment, in terms of amenities or other things, I don't know if program elements would really affect or drive design or design guidelines. They would certainly drive design.
Right.
Don't know if they're going to drive design guidelines, but will we have much information to work with?
Well, we'll have the airport master plan, which from a gross standpoint provides program based on forecast need.
Right.
So we'll know something about, you know, the types of facilities that we're talking about, a general arrangement that has been studied. But when you get down to the detail level, you know, like how is baggage handling going to be done? No, we're not going to have that level of detail. That
So kind of internal programming for the building we won't really have.
That's right.
Okay.
I mean, we'll know, we have identified through the master plan sort of a list of the essential functions and some idea of square footages, but those are really general, and we expect that that information is going to be modified, developed, refined during the design process.
Okay. If I may, Chair, to follow up, separate question, but already touched upon in your presentation, with all of the various guidelines already referred to, specifically on the federal regulations that already apply, are you going to provide summary of those to us? Because obviously whatever we might craft are going to have to nest under those guidelines. So will we get copies, or I've seen the CFRs, I know how complicated they are. Do we get a synopsis of them? How do we know what that framework is?
Well, there's two ways that we imagine doing that. We'll make whatever information you feel compelled to review available to you, and answer any questions that may flow out of whatever, cursory review you may have time to conduct along those lines.
Okay.
We will also do a summary. We've done somewhat of a summary on a few of them here today. But we'll, in our next, probably in our next task force meeting, we'll be going over some of those industry standards and that sort of thing. We also expect that when we come back to you with a draft of the standards, we are going to have done a first cut that's going to sort of be compatible with aviation standards. We're going to have to give you a head start on some of that. That's how we anticipate addressing that.
JD or Tim, how does that work? Because our airport currently has what you may think of as a variance, per se, by the FAA in terms of how the runway is and the setbacks. And so when we start to, even with the approval of the master plan, when we start to look at the potential for a second FBO and the designs, the process has to go back to the FAA to determine what they will allow. Explain that variance that the airport is currently under, which is a little unusual, I think.
But before I turn this to JD, who's more the expert on the variance process, let me just say that I think it's unlikely that the design standards that we'll be doing will be affected by the grosser level of influence that the aviation standards will be. That spacing between the runway and the taxiway is an important element of how the airport functions and works. But the design guidelines themselves probably won't influence that kind of a issue too much.
Okay.
We'll be on a little bit finer grain detail than that. If that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know and I'll take another shot at it.
Okay.
To answer your question on the modifications to standards, the airport has an approved ALP, and there are conditions for the approval of that ALP. But on that ALP, it considers all those separation standards, all those modifications to standards that you're talking about. So they're pre-planned and they're approved by the FAA. They either grant the modification or they don't. But all of that information is contained in the ALP and within the master plan. And a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, David, is contained. There is a lot of groundwork that's been done in terms of planning. Planning level work been done in the master plan, which is a great place to start.
Listen.
So my comment and questions come from the perspective of, I'm also a minority business owner of the businesses within the terminal. So there's the restaurant, there's a kiosk inside TSA, there's the small retail store inside and outside TSA. So when Rachel Michael talk about traveler amenities, I think of the restaurant and the bar and the retail. So when I look at some of the issue areas and the core values, I think of kind of design guidelines that we will be developing for what it looks like on the outside. Are we going to be, you kind of talked about, there are some general thoughts as to square footages, and based upon forecasting what kind of square footage you need for a retail store, how many retail stores, or things like that. But as has happened with the terminal today, those kinds of things are just kind of pigeonholed in there and kind of squeezed out. They're not, some of them, one of them is not very visible to passengers. There's no security for the restaurant and the bar at all when the airport terminal is starting to shut down. So are those kinds of things that I can gather information and bring to the task force that we can put into this?
That would be wonderful.
Or are we only looking on the outside?
No, we're not. We'll be looking largely on the outside because they're the sort of factors that we will have enough information to grapple about. Again, we're not going to be doing design of the terminal building, so there's a whole lot of, you know, programmatic information and square footage evaluation and relationship information, you know, that's really going to have to be left to the design process. But there are some things that I can imagine, for example, we will talk about. Like the building should take advantage of these views. Or we should give a higher priority to non-private vehicular access in our circulation system, or you know, the kinds of things that will influence how the building works on the inside somewhat. But we won't have the level of detail information, I think, to get at the specific sort of question that you were asking, Liz. But any information that you can bring to the table for consideration may lead us in a direction that could be productive and helpful.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, when we were getting ready to go to bed to begin this process, I had brought up the quote question of amenities. And it's not so much that they're going to be designing amenities, but while you have these great brains together and travelers, it's a chance to at least list them out as to these are the things we would expect to see in an interior of an operating healthy facility. And so it's not to detail what type of diaper changing restaurant, you know, facilities we need in the restroom, but that literally to just say that we would like to see restrooms that aren't cramped and crowded and you don't bang your suitcase into the door trying to, you know, get down the hall, and they're handicapped accessible and so on and so forth. So it wasn't really to start designing the amenities, but to really at least be able to detail the type of amenities that we would expect for passenger experience and things like that.
Will the committee look at, when it comes to design, and you talked about the quality of the experience in the interior setup, the needs of the airlines and the ability to go out and look for new and different service? So the industry sees an advantage in providing service to the airport?
I think I'm going to turn that one to Jim.
George, let me make sure I understand your question. Will we be targeting key points here to make it more appealing for airlines to operate at our airport?
Yes.
I think it fits under the amenity discussion that just took place. And we should be gathering, as I think Rachel said it really well, we've got this creative brain trust. I think we want to make sure that we can incorporate it, if nothing else, in notes and appendix information to help us for whatever step, you know, is in front of us next.
Rob?
I'm just curious, because I've seen a couple of committees like this come together for various things, and the budgetary aspects of things come into play far afterwards. And when we talk about, well, we want larger bathrooms, we'd love, you know, marble floors, we'd love, you know, 100% plus. I'm just saying, you know.
I never said marble floors.
I was talking earlier about another airport that had a very grandiose entrance to it, and you know, we talk about meeting 110% of ADA compliance, not just 100%. Those things cost money, and when we spend money on that, we're not spending money on something else. So, what aspect does this committee take into account the budgetary aspects of things, in the sense that we can't have everything?
Right.
Because that's important too, because we could sit here all day saying, I want this, 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 and then we can't afford it.
Yeah. The best way I think I can answer this is that first of all, the guidelines are called the guidelines for a reason. They're not going to be cast in stone. They're not going to make you do anything. And also, the outcome of this process will essentially allow and require the creativity of those who come after to work on these projects, to come up with a solution that meets your budget, that accomplishes the design guideline, the intent of that design guideline. We're not going to be ratcheting anything down so tightly that we're going to be costing you money by virtue of the statements that are in this document.
I think Jim can maybe piggyback off.
Can I just follow up quick before you go, Jim? Well, I guess I think it's important somewhere in this document, or at least through the process, to state and restate that budgetary impact comes in a later design process, and things may be cut because of that later design. So if you're, the comment that was made by Jeff about, I hope this doesn't just sit on a shelf and you follow our guidelines. Well, if you're not taking the budgetary aspects into account, we may not be able to follow your guidelines. So I just think that awareness is important as part of this process, that we as county commissioners, taking a guiding document and putting it into a policy-making decision, we account for a lot more than what that guiding document is guiding us towards. I think that's important to have stated somewhere in this document.
Jim?
Rob, I think you're right on the mark. Obviously, the challenge is always what comes first and how do you incorporate those pieces together. I think we have the opportunity to kind of help prioritize some of these issues as we look at them and say, we see this as a high priority to the extent that money can support, and that we keep that point in front of us. The challenge is that ultimately, if and when we decide to go forward with terminal detailed design, it's going to be one of those, we don't want to get it open, cut the ribbon and go, gosh, we probably could have got this a little better if we'd seen it coming. So trying to keep those creative thoughts coming forward can help us ultimately make prioritization. Value engineering choices is the cutting word in project management, but if we hadn't thought about them, they can't sit against all the other priorities that we may look at in a structure, be it a terminal or something else.
I think Steve and Rachel.
I think about two different airports that have done major building things. One being DIA, where the Anschutz family picked the perfect site for the airport, where they could put in anything they wanted just the way they wanted to do it. They got everybody trained now to drive to DIA in their cars because they didn't build the light rail thing there at the beginning, even though maybe that was part of the grand scheme of things. Now they're putting it in, everybody's used to their cars, and now they're going to have to try to train people to take the light rail instead of that. And I think if they'd put that in their design, saying that the public transportation interface is the most important and we need to do a mass transit thing as the main way to get people out there, that could have totally changed how DIA turned out. So kind of the emphasis that's put on the different things is important. Now they're putting it in, there's great construction things going on that reroutes the traffic trying to drive into DIA because they're adding their new hotel terminal there and the light rail thing. With a little better foresight, they probably could have avoided a lot of that. You look at the Santa Barbara airport, and they have a very low-tech baggage handling system for delivering it to the customers. And Jim, you told me that was because they ran out of money. And maybe they'll add that in later. So they have this really nice looking terminal. And maybe the passengers are maybe fine with the baggage system the way it is. I don't know, but it almost seems like you're right, they ran out of money and they didn't quite finish the project the way they had intended it. So I think keeping a balance between all of the different elements. Now we have our perfect location for the airport that probably Tom Sardi or somebody was the one who decided that's where our airport should go. And if we consider, or if you as a committee consider that we have the perfect site for an airport, and what do we want to have on that site, kind of ignoring everything that's there already, what would you come up with? And if we can keep that kind of a vision,